My name is Hannah Rittner, and I'm the curator in residence with the Stratford Festival, thanks to the generous support of the Canada Council for the Arts. I'm working on a project called the Feminist Expansion of the Western Canon, where I've found over 400 titles by women between the 17th and 20th century. Today, we are here to discuss one of the plays from the Uprising series called When Ladies Meet by Rachel Crothers. This play will be available for you to watch in person on Friday, August 20th at 8 p.m. and it is presented by the Meighen Forum. Today, we are joined by Meighen Watson, who is directing the reading. She's a director and a theater maker originally from Ottawa, and she is the current artistic associate at the Grand Theatre in London, Ontario. Hello, Meighen.
Hello, Hannah. Thank you for having me and for that introduction. I'm just so grateful to have this time to chat with you about this playwright who you introduced me to. So, first, thank you for that. And I think we should launch right in so that we can share some info and get a sense of this play and who she is. So, tell us about Rachel Crothers, like who she is, how did she get to playwriting, and then the bigger question, how or why do her plays resonate with us today?
Oh, I love this question so much. So Rachel Crothers was born in Illinois in 1878 to two quite religious parents. But the thing that makes her incredibly unique is that her mother was actually one of the first medical doctors, female medical doctors in the region of Bloomingdale that they were from. And her family actually, her mother's family was very close with Abraham Lincoln's family. So we could imagine that political discussions about social justice, about the future of America would be very prevalent in her family. She was known to be a pretty precocious young person, and she actually encountered Ibsen's work quite young, in her mid-teens. And she fell absolutely in love with A Doll's House, and it inspired her to want to be an actor. Ibsen at the time was considered so provocative. So it would be like, a kid growing up in the 90s at the age of 15 falling in love with Marina Abramovich. Like, it was just as irreverent, just as wild for someone of that age to encounter that kind of work. She moved to New York to become an actor when she was 19. And at that time, it was, 1903. The suffragette movement and all of that stuff informing the women's movement was very prevalent. And she was starting to get inspired to write. And the first play that she wrote was called Nora, which was her own interpretation of Ibsen's Nora. From there, she wrote over 30 plays from 1903 to 1937. Her latest work, When Susan Meets God, was actually adapted into an MGM film, which Joan Crawford starred in. So that is the genesis of Rachel Crothers.
What do you think it is about her plays that might connect to us today? Like, just generally speaking, as you've started to dive into her work a bit over the last little while.
A woman's worth is not defined by her relationship status. Her relationship status and the world of romance is a playground for her to explore subversive identity and also to serve her and her inspiration for other things. We've never had more quote unquote single women, at least in the West, than ever before over the age of 25. And some of these women are single by choice. Some of them are having less conventional relationships, and some of them just are waiting and figuring it out. And I think a lot of those women have a lot in common with the protagonists of Crothers' work. And then, outside of gender and those discussions, she's very much, talking about questions of identity, social responsibility, what it means to be a person in the world who might have a great deal of ambition, but maybe not quite as aware of the impact they're having on the world, which I think is also very relevant to today, as some people who get more and more success become less connected. And I think she's also examining those things and those themes.
Hannah, I would love for us to get a bit specific about When Ladies Meet. So, do you want to
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about the play and where it sits in her body of work?
She wrote 31 plays. and most of them got produced, and most of them were very commercially successful. But towards the end of her career, which this play sits, it's I think the 29th or the 28th play out of the 31, she started becoming more acquainted with Hollywood and with the stars of Hollywood. And there's a certain kind of majesty and intentionality, I think, about this work. There's a glamour to it in, Mary Howard, the main character, who she's this woman in her 30s who has all of this ambition with her creative career. It's kind of tongue in cheek with all of these starlets of the golden age of that time, but through the setting of writing. And I think it's fair to say too, this play is kind of written in anticipation that stars might play these roles. So as I said, the play focuses on this amazing young woman, Mary Howard, who is an incredibly talented writer, and she's about to publish a new book, and she's trying to figure out the ending of this book. And the book explores, without giving too much away, unconventional relationships and a woman engaged in an unconventional relationship at the time. And her friend Jimmy and her open the play. They're in this lovely estate in upstate New York, I believe, just outside of the city. And they're having a conversation about it. And it becomes very clear that art begins to mirror life as Mary is faced with the potential of having to deal with the in-person realities of her own choices.
Yeah.
And then the rest just bubbles up and becomes super fun. There's a lot of irreverent comedy in it, but it's also incredibly heartbreaking. And it's very much about, as I discussed before, women self-determining and finding their worth outside of a relationship.
I'm really kind of struck by the parallel that is drawn between Ibsen and her work, and particularly Nora. And even as we talk about the glamour in this piece, there still is this kind of experiment with that origin of what Nora does in adulthood.
Totally. One of my favorite things that my playwriting teacher, Eduardo Machado, said in graduate school, he said the moment that Nora walks out of the house was the beginning of modern theater, which I think might have been something Peter Brook said, like probably a more famous theater theorist, but it is such an amazing image. And we know that an image like that, I won't give it away who does it, is in the show. And so it's so clear that it's deeply embedded in her imaginative palette as a storyteller.
I'll ask you a question now that will draw upon some of your wordsmithing prowess, which is if you could pick 4 words to describe this play, what would they be?
Oh, oh my gosh. Okay, so I think I would describe it as irreverent, seething. There's a seething quality to it. I would describe it as pretty because there's a lot of pretty language and there's a pretty setting. And then I would also say liberating as the last one.
One question that I did not get to ask yet, which I would be remiss if I did not, is how does When Ladies Meet connect to this idea of uprising for you?
Oh, yes. Thank you for that. It's a really amazing question. I mean, at the center of the story, we have a woman who is learning how to self-determine out of a relationship and becoming her own, essentially her own best friend, and learning what it actually means to be who she is on her own, being, this provocative novelist at the beginning of the 20th century without anyone else potentially. And we've also got other women in the play that make some very incredible choices and where they choose themselves. All of the characters, all the women characters are really making choices for themselves. And that's the drama of it. The drama isn't who do they choose, this guy or that guy. It's actually how do they come to choose themselves, which for me is an act of uprising out of the context that they were given. This is a perfect segue actually to talk about sort of your immediate thoughts and responses when you read this work, because as I said, she's so prolific, she's so important, and she has been forgotten. And I'm so excited to sort of bring her back into the center of the conversation. So please tell me what you initially thought when you read the work.
In my process as a director, the most exciting moment for me is reading a play through for the first time, where there's a possibility that I will get to kind of indulge in that world and play with the people involved and create based on the text that's in hand. So the first read is really important to me, and I will say that. This text, this script is a page turner, and I was sort of like, well, so what is it about it that's keeping me sort of like, just so engrossed? And I think the big thing for me is particularly the characters and how right out the gates they subvert expectations. So I think sometimes I can be a little bit pessimistic and think, oh, we're going to have some stereotypes here. We're going to have some, particularly if we're looking at plays from the 1930s or earlier, and so I think, okay, but over and over again, as I was reading, I'd have to flip back to an earlier description of a character to say, I thought I knew who Bridget was going to be, and things fly out of her mouth, and I think, oh, this is going to be fun. So, so that the page turning aspect of it for me was really about the characters. And when that happens as a director, when I get a script like that, I think, oh, this is going to be a dream with actors, right? It's just such a gift to be able to be in a rehearsal hall with a text where uh, nobody is being asked to play a one-dimensional character, and I can really say that in earnest about this text. So just out the gates, very excited to spend some time, in our limited amount of time together, thinking about the relationship dynamics and how we can't come at this one note or with a like just sort of a broad brush stroke, and that kind of joy that an actor can take in a role is really what translates to an audience as a real pleasurable time in the theater, right?
Yeah, totally.
So that's a big one. And then, the larger questions of theme, I think you've said a lot that really resonates with me in terms of how I would tackle this for a larger production. But one thing I was thinking about this morning, and it's a real simple little director's trick, which is, what's the title of the play? Well, the title of the play is When Ladies Meet. It's not When Lovers Meet. It's not Affairs Abound.
Yeah, no.
So, that right there is a great starting place to really investigate the autonomy and self-determination, as you describe, of particularly the three female characters in the play and how they are, from different circumstances and perspectives, tackling this idea of autonomy.
I'm also curious, to touch back on the point that you said about normally the plays that you would read by men at that time, I believe, Eugene O'Neill was a peer of hers, written by men. And I'm also curious about the effect it has on you to sort of, as a director, as a storyteller, as a woman, to read something from this time through the gaze of this woman who herself, like Rachel Crothers herself, was quite extraordinary.
It's a great question and it's a big question. And I wish it didn't have to be such a central question,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But it truly is. And I take that responsibility really seriously in terms of how, as a woman, I approach text that, um, historically either stereotypes, marginalizes, gaslights, makes the butt of a joke of women. And we're talking about women in this context, but that sort of thing applies across sort of all marginalized group when we take
absolutely,
text
yeah.
from the past that doesn't have the same social framework that we're working with today, right? So I think about how I've been directing for a number of years now, and my career has consisted of predominantly directing plays by men, with the exception of new work, right? And I've only recently really started to articulate this for myself, but there is a sense of there's this part of my artistic brain, my person brain, heart, that is trying to protect the women, not only in the play, but in the room, the actors, and then also in the audience, right? And this is, I'll share that sometimes what happens in the context of a rehearsal, um, when you're dealing with text that sort of belittles or undermines the female or objectifies the female character in play, I'll go to an actor and say, hi, I know that this line is meant to be submissive or this line is meant to be played this way, but I'm wondering if we can endow it with a different sense. Now, that's the best tool I have as a director in 2021 to try to subvert some of these moments, is to take it and kind of maybe fit a bit of a round peg into a square hole, like that. You sort of shape and do what you can, but ultimately that's a really tricky spot to put an actor in, right? Because they're having to work against the text, and it kind of unravels from there, right? But I'm a fan of that. I would rather do that than not do that, right? Right.
Yeah.
So when a play like When Ladies Meet sort of shows up on my desk, or having the opportunity to kind of indulge in Rachel Crothers' work, there's this moment where that protection and that sense that I have to ensure that we're not causing more harm gets to soften a bit. And so we can be in the room and we can really play and dig in and not have to have that part of ourselves really active to, and so that's a real treat.
Yeah, it's, I
Real.
mean, it's such a gift when you don't have to feel defensive or in anticipation of harm in a room. It's takes such a muscle to be able to have to build yourself around that. And it's so exciting to see what kind of art is going to come from this particular experience, where that isn't, it doesn't have to be the case.
I want to come back to the fact that this play is funny.
It's so funny.
Right? So the delight that we will have in rehearsal and then with the audience that night is that, part of my job is to really kind of light it up and get that sense of joie de vivre that these characters have, and that sense of experimentation with who they are in the world. And that in some moments that's really funny, and in some moments that's really vulnerable. But I think it'll be really relatable to the audience, right?
Totally. It's like Noel Coward meets Nora Ephron in this beautiful bouquet of, creative elite New Yorkers at the beginning of the 20th century. It's going to be so fun. This has been such a beautiful conversation, Meighen. I just loved speaking with you about this, and I'm so grateful for the thoughts that you've shared. Is there anything else you want to say before we say goodbye to our lovely audience?
No, I think that's it. I think, I've enjoyed what we've covered today, and I can't wait to continue the conversation with an audience as we take it to the stage.
Thank you all so much for joining this conversation. Thank you, Meighen, for participating. You can see the reading of When Ladies Meet on Friday, August 20th at 8 p.m. And we so look forward to seeing you there. Meighen Watson will be directing it, and there's going to be a great deal of joy and delight. Thank you so much.